Lord willing. There we are. What we're going to talk about this quarter is organization of the church. It's a project I've been working on for a little while, and so I want to use it for a Bible class and see how that works. But what I want to do as we go through is today we're going to talk about how Jesus is the head of the church. And then as we go through our 13 weeks, we're going to talk about elders, the role of elders, qualifications of elders, deacons, what deacons do, qualifications of deacons, preachers, what in the world preachers do, if I ever can figure that one out. And then we're going to talk about members, role of men, role of women. Did I give y'all one of these? I don't know if I did or not. I did. Okay. And so we're going to run through and do it in that way. I think it's a good lesson because it's important for us. Although most people in here probably know this pretty well, I think it's important for us to review these sort of things and figure it out. There's a story about a Boy Scout leader. His troop, the boys, ran into a store. And as he ran through the store, they picked up snacks and drinks and whatever, paid for them, and then off they went. 5 minutes later, the master, the guy who's over them, showed up, and he said, "Hey, some boys been in here?" And he said, "Well, yeah." And he said, tell me where they went, which direction, because I'm their leader. They're following me." Sometimes that happens with leadership, doesn't it? You're supposed to be in charge of somebody, but it doesn't feel like anybody. It feels like everybody else is going in every direction. That is true of maybe every man-made organization. A lot of times the leaders aren't the leaders. Sometimes somebody else is doing their own thing. Sometimes it just looks like chaos when you look into it, and it's hard to keep up. And so as we think about the church today, what I want us to notice is the head of the church, not the preacher. The head of the church is not even the elders. The head of the church is Jesus Christ. And so that helps us with attitude. That helps us with direction. That helps us with motivation, and that's absolutely something that'll help us in everything that we do. Many times people will get mad at the preacher, and because they get mad at the preacher, it messes up their whole spirituality. They'll quit the church. They'll quit coming. Or if they come, they'll come and just spread bitterness and anger or whatever else. Sometimes people get mad at elders about decisions that they make one way or the other. And when that happens, it causes bitterness. It makes people very upset, and you've got a lot of different issues. The reason you and I come to church, the reason I'm here, is my love for Jesus. I want to glorify him in every single thing that I do. And because of that, I do everything I can to promote spirituality. I do everything I can to promote unity as well. I was talking to some people a few weeks ago, and they attended another congregation. They had come over, and we were going back and forth, and they had had some problems with the congregation where they were at. And they said, "We may come to your church," which is kind of funny. It's sure not my church. And they said, "But we may go where you go. You know, we don't know. We feel a little connected to this place, a little we're used to going to this place, and we don't know where we should go. And so I don't know if they wanted a sales pitch from me or whatever in the world." And here's what I told them. You need to always have the priority that you need to get to heaven. It's absolutely goal number one. Goal 1A or even above that, you need to get your kids to heaven. And so find a church that follows God. Find a church that's the shortest path between you and heaven, and between you and having your children go to heaven. That is absolutely goal number one. Because Jesus is the head of the church, and I am not. I think every one of us should say that, whether you're the preacher or not. Jesus is the head of the church, and I am not. Okay, so we say that. Now let's talk about what that means, okay? First and foremost, he is head in authority. It's Jesus who says exactly everything that we are to do. And so, Ephesians 1:21 through 23, all things are under his power. Other translations say under his feet. And he gave him to be head over all things to the church, which is his body. All right. Sometimes as we get older, weird things happen to our bodies, right? Weird things happen to our bodies. Hair grows in places hair wasn't before, and hair disappears from places where it was before. Weird things happen to our body. We work and exercise on Saturday, and on Sunday morning, it is hard to get out of bed because suddenly we're sore. Things like that happen, okay? As you age, sometimes disease sets in, and your mind tells your body to do something, and your body begins to argue back sometimes. And many diseases are that way. Muscular sclerosis, Parkinson's, many things are that way. As God, through His Spirit, is defining to us the church, He lets us know that the head of the church is Jesus Christ. It is Jesus that we follow. It's Jesus' commands that we follow. And when we argue back, or when we're rebellious, that means there's disease in the body. It's Jesus who is the head of the church. So Colossians 1, 18 through 19, He is the head of the church, who is beginning, firstborn from the dead, that in all things He may have, you ready for this? It's hard to spell, preeminence, okay? He is first and foremost above everything in this world that we face, above everything in this world that is here. And so that's important for us to know. Hebrews 1. I love Hebrews 1, 1 through 3. Usually I quote it out of the King James because I like the way the King James writes, especially in this passage, okay? God, who at sundry times and diverse manners, isn't that kind of pretty? Other translations say, God, who in different times and in different ways, God, who at sundry times and diverse manners spoke to the prophets in times past, has in these last days spoken to us by His Son. And He has appointed Him heir of all things. Who is it that tells us what we need to do to go to heaven? Jesus, through His Word. He is the head of the church. John 14, 6, I am the way, the truth, the life. No man comes to the Father but by me. Even the Apostle Paul got checked in Acts 17. The Bereans were noble because they did what? You remember? What made the Bereans noble? They checked the Scriptures. They read the Scriptures to see if the things which Paul was preaching was true. That's something that every preacher needs you to do. Every preacher needs you to check him out and make sure that what he says is true and is right. All right, so it's Jesus who offers a pathway to heaven. It's Jesus who is the head of the church. It's Jesus who has all authority, who is head of the church in all things. Philippians 2, remember in verse 5, your attitude, your mind should be the same as that of Christ Jesus. Verses 6 through 8, his attitude, he was equal with God. He made himself to be nothing, even to the cross. He gave himself up to be dead. Beginning of verse 9 and 10, that the name of Jesus, every knee should bow, those in heaven, those on the earth, those under the earth, and every tongue should confess that He is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. All right, so looking at that, we see the idea that He has all authority in all things. Now, play with me for a second with this word game I've got. There's a lot of analogies in Scripture, and think with me of them if you would. How does the Bible define the relationship between Jesus and His church? Let me start off with the easiest to give you an idea. Ephesians 5. Jesus is the husband. The church is what? The bride of Christ. Okay? What are some other examples? The shepherd and the sheep. Going back to John 10, Ezekiel 33, 1 Peter 5. Okay? You think of another one? You get a master-slave relationship. We follow Him in what He does. And even when we obey Him fully, the writer says we're nothing more than just a servant. Okay? You think of any others? He's an heir of the Father. Okay? And he has brought us in, grafted us. If you'll look in Romans chapter, I think it's chapter 15. No, wait, 10. I think we are grafted into the olive tree. Maybe Romans 11. To be fellow heirs of the grace of Christ. You think of any others? We're brethren. We're friends, as you look in the book of John. Okay. So when you and I think about over these coming weeks as we go through talking about organization, even when we talk about elders and their authority over the church, even when we talk about preachers and their role and the authority which they have, even when we go into the intricate things about what God expects of men in the church, what God expects ladies of the church, remember in all things it boils down to Jesus is the head of the church. It is he who has all authority. It is he who is over all things. And so everything goes back to Jesus. Now, we may hear something about elders or about preachers, and we're like, I don't like that idea. It'd be a lot easier if we did it this way or that way or whatever else. Who gets to make the rules? Jesus does, right? The Father does. And so it goes back. He is head in authority. Number 2, he's head in example. All right? 1 John chapter 2 and verse 6, he who abides, that is, lives in him, ought himself to walk just as he walked. Okay? You walk in the light, 1 John 1:7, you go a little bit later, he says you need to walk in the same way that Jesus walked. Okay? Paul, talking about his ministry in 1 Corinthians 11:1, said, imitate me even as I imitate Christ. You don't have it here, but I like what Paul says to Timothy, 1 Timothy 3. We have him as a pattern, right? It's also in Philippians chapter 3. That pattern is the word tupos, which means pattern or design or blueprint. How is Jesus a blueprint for us? What are we talking about when we say he's a blueprint or a tupos, a type? Okay. Study him and follow him. Our goal, as Van says, is every day to look more like Jesus. Every day, look a little bit more like Jesus. Now, there's the first obvious thing and it's the easiest thing. We look like Jesus when we obey the gospel. When we admit that we cannot save ourselves, we submit ourselves through repentance and through baptism to be added to the Lord's church. Then, at that point, it gets hard, I think. Because once we belong to Christ, we've got to look like Christ. The way we treat people has to be the same way Jesus treated people. Now, we like to hang out in John 2, right? We say, you know what? Jesus overturned tables and threw everybody out of the temple. You ever want to do that to some folks? That's not how we look like Jesus. When we talk about looking like Jesus, we spend a little bit more time on the Sermon on the Mount. Because we're not the Son of God, we can't read people's hearts like Jesus did. We learn to turn the other cheek. We learn that when somebody tells us to go a mile and makes us to do it, we end up going 2 miles for them. We learn that even when we're beaten, we show no revenge back. Yes, sir.
I worked in an engineering firm, was my first job, a blueprint operator. The original is on sepia paper originally. Then you run a blueprint,
Mm-hmm.
and the edges are printed blue and whatever. So the sepia paper is God. God is the original. Christ is the blueprint. He lived just the way the Father to represent the blueprint, and we carry the blueprint to see how to conduct ourselves to be like him.
Okay. Was everybody able to hear that?
Engineering department.
Okay. And that's really what it comes across to. All right. As you read John chapter 1, nobody has ever seen God. But guess what? In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and the Word became flesh. That's that idea of Word. Why is Jesus called Logos? Word. How do we communicate? Words. The way that I'm communicating to you the Word of God today is by communication, language. The way that God shows us who he is through the word, through Jesus. And so while no man has seen God, people have seen Jesus. They beheld him, touched him, saw him, heard him. 1 John chapter 1. And so that is the blueprint. And each one of us are to be Christians or mini Christ. We are to be Jesus to the world that's around us. Now, 307 people today. 307 people. Kind of a funny joke, and you may have noticed when I was trying to read the board earlier, I was at the eye doctor a few months ago, and he was talking about eyesight and everything, and he said, you know, if you're not wearing your glasses, you really can't see anything more than about 10 feet. And I said, that's what helps me preach so well. I'm just standing in a room, bunch of blurry figures. I don't know if they're picking up stones to stone me or what. You know, I'm good to go. So sometimes it's a little hard for me. But we had 307 this morning. People's attitude about Jesus comes from you. The majority of the Benton community, there's a little over 3,000 people live in the city limits. About 36,000 people live in the county. Never step into this building. They don't always hear the sermons that are on our radio. They don't see the literature that we have. But people's impression of the Benton Church of Christ, and better than that, people's impression of Jesus is what they see in their interaction with every single person. When people see Mark or somebody else, Mark Ray or somebody else at Walmart, and I'm acting a certain way, whatever it is, whether I'm angry or whether I'm happy, that's their impression of what it means to be a Christian, what it means to be a preacher, and what it means to be a member of the Benton Church of Christ. When people see you at work, when people see you hanging out with other folks, that's their impression. You're the word, you are the copy of Jesus Christ given to those other people. What is it they say? Not everybody will read their Bible, and so you may be the only Bible that other people read. And so Jesus is our example, and we imitate him. All right. Keep cruising here. Hebrews 5, 8, and 9. Though he was a son, yet he learned obedience by the things which he suffered. And having been perfected, he became the author of eternal salvation to all who obey him. God made sure that Jesus suffered in our place. He became sin even though he was sinless, so that we can be made sinless even though we have been sinful. He made him take our place. 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 21. Now, if Jesus endured for the cross, guess what we do? Yes, sir, Bob. Oh, you're just hanging out. All right. All right. Hebrews 12:2. Looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne room of God. Now, Hebrews 12:2 you can't understand unless you study Hebrews 11. Hebrews 11 you can't understand unless you read Hebrews 10, 21 through 28. But we're not going to go back that far, but let's go back to Hebrews 11. Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Samson, Gideon. You go through that list that's in Hebrews 11. Those people weren't superhuman. You know, we see these Marvel characters, if you've seen those movies, Superman who has the outfit, Iron Man who has the outfit. They're able to do beyond what regular mortal people can do. One thing we oftentimes forget, Abraham was a guy just like us. And he wasn't always perfect. We just had Valentine's Day. If you have a spouse, hopefully you remembered. My favorite thing to do Valentine's Day is about 4 o'clock, go to Walmart and look at the card aisle. Because you see all these men just staring, going, I got to get something. What do I do? Right? And it's one of my favorite things to do because I've already got mine so I can make fun of everybody else. It's not my favorite thing to do when I've got to get one. But as you go through that, it's important for us to recognize and know that Abraham, he messed up sometimes. Wives, how would you feel if somebody thought you were good looking and so your husband said, hey, why don't you just marry my wife? You can have her. You know, most wives wouldn't be open to that at all. Abraham did that to Pharaoh in Egypt because he was scared of Pharaoh. A little bit later, Abraham learned his lesson so well, he did it again to the king of the Philistines. Abraham messed up. What made him different? He repented, he lived by faith, and he was willing to obey the call of God. Noah was a man who struggled greatly. We see that after the flood, as he struggled with a lot of things. But when it counted, he lived by faith, and he trusted God, and he did what he could to follow him. Gideon was scared to death, but he lived by faith, and God took care of him. Samson was a man who was filled with all sorts of fleshly appetites and was selfish as can be. But at the end of his life, he lived by faith. He made peace with God, and he did what God sent him to this world to do. Now, what I want us to notice as we go through that is Hebrews 11 needs to be encouragement to us. It's a faith hall of fame, but these aren't superheroes. These are people who struggled mightily. And yet, when they held to their faith, God blessed them, God knew them, and God bragged about them. And so then we get to Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 1, and it says, therefore, as we continue our running, strengthen those knees, lift those hands, recognize God is with you, because Jesus is the author and finisher of our faith. Now, we had a lot of our church members who yesterday ran in a marathon and a half marathon. Never will understand that sport. Tell people oftentimes the only place I run is the bathroom and the fridge. Okay? I have a son who runs at Freed Ardeman. He's second place on the team right now, and so he's doing pretty well. Every morning he gets up and runs 10 miles, and I just think, bless his heart, you know. Guess he'll graduate from college skinny. I don't know, you know. But he does really well. When you're running a race, it's hard to finish. And what Hebrews 12:2 is really telling us about is when you're running the race, Jesus is there to help you finish the race. You may be struggling now, but Jesus is going to be with you. He's going to help you through it. That's that example that we're looking at. Number 3, he's the head of the church in love. We'll talk about this a little bit more in the afternoon sermon. A new command I give to you, that you love one another as I have loved you, and that you also love one another. Okay? We are to love one another. Now, what's the context of John 13? You're washing what? Feet, right? And why are we washing feet? The apostles are arguing with each other, and what's the argument? Who's the greatest? Peter is the spokesman. John's the disciple who Jesus loved. Judas is the guy who gets a hold of money and does all the business transactions. Who's the greatest apostle? Who's best? Well, Jesus comes in and begins washing feet. And he says, what I want you to realize, the key to greatness in the church is not what everybody says about you. The key to greatness is whether or not you serve and love other people. When you and I begin going through elders and deacons and preachers, recognize the key is love and the key is service that is there. So this is my command, John 15, that you love one another even as I have loved you. John 14:19, this blank is important. We love him, why? Because, all right? That's that important word that's there. We love him because he first loved us. Now, some people are Christians because their family has always gone here. They grew up in the youth group. They may even sit on the same pew they always have. Some people are Christians because it's reasonable. You study some of those books back there by Apologetics Press, you'll find out that the most reasonable answer to the existence of life is God. And so therefore you ought to be Christians and you want to go to heaven and not to go to hell. Some people are Christians because it's the closest. This building's the closest one to them. Some are here because they love the youth group or the older person's group or whatever else it may be. Jesus says true Christianity, when we're mature, we love him because he first loved us. If you put your faith in a person, or make it more personal, if you put your faith in a preacher, what's going to happen? You're going to be disappointed. Preachers are not perfect. If you put your faith in a mortal person, that person's mortal. He's fallible. And he's going to make mistakes. The key to your faithfulness is loving God. And the way that you love God is recognize what he has done for you. Okay? By this we know love, because he laid down his life for us. Therefore, beloved brethren, we must also lay down our lives for the brethren. All right, so you see the aspect coming across here. This idea of he is the head in love. The most famous passage of John, of the New Testament, John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only precious begotten Son, that whosoever should believe in him should not perish but should have everlasting life. John 3:17. For he did not come into this world to condemn it, but he came into this world that he, through his love, through his work, might save it. Okay. Love. That is what it all boils down to. Yes, sir.
Also, of course, it always was interesting to me. This, he says, is a new commandment.
Yes.
And it's because it's on a higher plane.
That's absolutely right.
He's been wanting love all during the history, but he says now you see the height of love that we must have if we're going to be his followers.
That's true.
So it's a new commandment.
Yes.
Even though he's
Yes.
used the word love before.
Yes. Yeah. A lot of people sometimes will say, how is this a new commandment? Because in the Old Testament it says you are to love one another. And Jesus is quoting it. What Jesus is saying is this is a higher plane. It's a better fulfillment of God's command that this is done out of love. Now, the Pharisees, Sadducees, what they said was if you follow the law enough, then you can be saved. If you do not go any further than you should on the Sabbath, if you never eat barbecue or catfish, if you follow all these 300 rules, if you sacrifice the way you're supposed to, and you don't mess up, then maybe you can be saved. Jesus flips that around. And he says, if you love God, if you love and are devoted to God, then you'll be saved. Now, there's still all the requirements that are there, right? You still have to be baptized. You still need to come to church. You still need to avoid sin. But there's the motivation. The motivation of the old way is, man, I don't want to go to hell. I don't want to be lost. I don't want to get zapped. The motivation that Jesus pushes is, I love God so much, I'm going to do everything in this world for him. I'm going to give myself up and absolutely follow God. That's where the issue happens a lot of times in church. A lot of times we get legalistic, and no matter how hard we work, we feel like, man, I haven't done enough to be saved. Man, I'm not good enough. I'm in big trouble. That's not Christianity. Christianity is loving God and giving him your absolute best. Not because you have to, but because you want to. Does that make sense? Okay, all right. Fourthly, he is head in service. Once again, going back to foot washing. For I have given you that means it starts with a vow, given you an example that you should do as I have done to you. Should we do foot washing in church today? Some denominations do. That's not what Jesus is after here. Our feet do not need to be washed like they did in the first century. Jesus is saying, I want you to be a slave to other people. I want you to serve because Jesus has served you. Reflect the love of God for every one of us. 1 John 4:7. The kids sing this oftentimes in our youth group songs. Beloved, let us love one another, for God is love. And everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. He who does not love does not know God, for God is love. That love brings us to service. That love brings us to being what God would want us to be. All right, pulling all that together, what are the implications? Why, in the real world, does it matter that we always recognize Christ is the head of the church? We can all be one, okay? All of us are motivated in the same direction. You remember the old story about the boys and they're having a challenge with one another over who can walk in the straightest line across the field of snow? I know nobody has seen snow in a couple of years, it feels like. But March is coming. Watch it snow for Tater Day. It always happens this way. But there's a contest. All right, how are you going to get across this field in the straightest line? First kid, what's he do? He says, I want to make sure that I don't make a mistake. So he looks back and he walks to make sure his line is straight. Well, the line, of course, is going to turn, right? The next kid says, I'm going to watch it. And so I'm going to follow exactly like this. Well, that doesn't work. The next person looks on the far side of the field, finds a fence post, and walks directly to that fence post. And, of course, his line's straight. What's the lesson? If you're measured only by the things in the past, you may always judge yourself that way, but you're not going to go in the right way. If you're looking at every intricate thing all the time, you're going to end up where you don't want to be. But if you focus on Christ, if you focus on that horizon, you'll get there. You'll get exactly where you need to be. Okay, what's another implication? If you follow Christ and not man, what will be the condition of your faith? It'll be good. Jesus has never let a person down. He has never let a person down. Put your faith in Jesus and not man. He will keep you through whatever it is that you're facing. All right, it's 11 o'clock. Remember the rule, what we say in the auditorium class? If he lets you out early, what happens? Don't run in the halls. I don't want to have to go call your kids. All right? Thanks for being here.